At family dinner, I said. Dad has decided I want to open a coffee shop. Dad? An old Navy guy selling lattes? What a joke. Jason's laughter shook the steakhouse. My family sat frozen, no one defending me. I swallowed the burn of shame, but not for long because months later, Jason came begging to work at my coffee. Before we dive into how it came to this, if you believe karma always finds its way, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. I was 65 the night Jason mocked me in front of everyone. But the truth is, my story with him began much earlier. I'm Rodrigo Collins, retired Navy, father of one daughter, and for most of my life I believed my greatest duty was not the years I gave to my country, but the years I gave to my family. I wore sacrifice like a second skin, first for my men, later for my own blood. When my daughter brought Jason home, I welcomed him with open arms. He was young, ambitious, and full of talk about startups and business ventures. I wanted to believe in him, wanted my daughter to have a man who could give her the world. He looked me in the eye and called me "Sir," with respect in his voice. And I, foolishly, thought he saw me as more than just a stepping stone. The first time Jason got into credit card trouble, I stepped in without hesitation. "Dad, I'm drowning," he admitted over the phone, his voice shaking. I wired the money that same night. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want him to feel small. I thought that was what family did, we protect, even when no one else knows. When his business idea came along, I didn't hesitate. I poured savings into it, even trimmed from my pension. I told myself it was an investment in my daughter's future. When the bank needed someone to guarantee Jason's mortgage, I signed the papers. "You've always been there for us, Dad," my daughter said, hugging me with tears in her eyes. I stood straighter that night, proud to still be needed. I didn't see the small cracks forming. Jason stopped saying thank you. Instead, he spoke as if my help was owed to him. He began to treat my sacrifices like loose change, pocketed without thought. But back then, I ignored it. I told myself he was just stressed, busy, trying to build something. I wanted to believe the best in him. Looking back, maybe that was my biggest flaw. I thought loyalty would be returned with loyalty. I never imagined that the man I pulled from the mud would one day shove my face into it before an entire room of strangers. The slide from gratitude to arrogance was so slow I almost missed it. At first, Jason brought me coffee when he came by, asked about my service, listened to my stories with that eager, respectful nod. Then the nods turned into smirks. "You're old school, Dad," he'd say, as if it were a compliment. "We do things differently now." It began with little cuts that didn't bleed right away. At a barbecue, he corrected how I held the tongs. At the hardware store, he took the receipt from my hand and said he would handle the return because their system is online, not on paper. When I offered advice, he called it cute. My daughter laughed along. I told myself not to make it a thing. I noticed the way he performed for people, especially in front of his friends. He'd toss me tasks like I was an intern. "Rodrigo, can you grab the ice?" "Rodrigo, the trash is full." The first time he called me by my first name in front of the family, my daughter didn't even flinch. It landed heavy, then sank. The housewarming party should have been a celebration of beginnings. I had signed the mortgage guarantee only days before. Guests filled every corner, music thumping, champagne and flutes. Jason gave a toast about hustle and fearlessness, about building from scratch. He didn't mention the man who kept that house from slipping through their fingers. I clapped anyway because my girl looked happy. He started introducing me as my wife's dad instead of by my name. It sounded small, like a label on a storage box. He called me steady, dependable, a safe pair of hands. And then, like a joke, he added, "He's not a visionary, but he's reliable." Everyone chuckled. My chest felt tight, but I smiled. My Navy training taught me to absorb the hit and stay on mission. When he needed a short-term loan to cover payroll, I sent the money before sunrise. When his vendor threatened legal action, I spent hours on the phone smoothing it over. My phone log filled with his crises, my nights with his emergencies. I gave, and still, he wanted more. One evening, I mentioned my idea of opening a small coffee shop, a quiet place, with old photographs and clean lines, where people could sit and breathe. Jason tilted his head, measured me like a prospect. "That's sweet," he said, words sugar-coated and sharp. "Maybe something smaller, like a hobby." It should have warned me. It didn't. I heard the condescension, but I chose to hear hope. I chose family again. The steakhouse glittered with chandeliers, voices rising above the clatter of plates and the hum of karaoke speakers. It was my birthday dinner, though it felt more like Jason's stage. He held court at the far end of the table, his friends and business partners hanging on his every word. I sat quietly, glass in hand, waiting for the right moment. My chest swelled with nervous pride as I cleared my throat and spoke. Dad has decided he wants to open a coffee shop. My voice was steady, even hopeful. For a second, silence hung over the table. Forks hovered midair. Then Jason slammed his fist down, rattling silverware and jolting the room. Dad? An old Navy guy out of his prime selling lattes? What a joke! His laughter tore through the quiet like a siren. The people around him joined in snickers, mock applause, phones raised to capture the humiliation. My daughter lowered her eyes but said nothing. The sound of their laughter echoed inside me louder than the speakers blaring pop songs. I sat frozen, the burn of humiliation crawling up my neck. I wanted to vanish, to melt into the leather of the booth, but I stayed still. Years of military training kept me composed, though every heartbeat screamed betrayal. Jason stood, raising his glass in mock salute. To Dad's coffee shop! May it be the quietest place in town. More laughter followed, even from distant tables. A waiter passed by, whispering sympathy with his eyes, but no words left his lips. I searched the faces around me. My daughter looked torn, caught between her husband's bravado and my quiet shame. My grandchildren giggled nervously, not understanding the cruelty, but sensing the spectacle. And me? I swallowed hard, the taste of steak gone sour in my mouth. The chandeliers above sparkled like stars, but I felt small, crushed under their light. Every chuckle, every smirk, carved a scar. And as phones recorded my humiliation, I knew those videos would live far longer than this dinner. Respect had finally shattered. Jason had made sure of it. I drove home from the steakhouse in silence that night, the city lights blurring as though even they pitied me. The laughter still rang in my ears, bouncing around inside my skull with no escape. It wasn't just Jason's cruelty that hurt, it was the silence of everyone else. Not one voice rose for me. Not my daughter's, not my grandchildren's, not even the friends who had known me for decades. Their quiet consent cut deeper than Jason's mocking words. At home, I poured myself a glass of water, though what I really craved was something stronger. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the framed photographs lining the wall, my Navy days, my daughter as a child, the family trips I had funded, the mortgage papers I had signed. Each image felt like a relic of loyalty that no longer existed. I had traded my pension, my treasures, and years of sweat for the chance to see them thrive. And now, they treated me as a relic too, something old, outdated, disposable. The next morning, I pretended nothing was wrong. I smiled at neighbors, walked my usual route, even waved to the mailman. But inside, humiliation gnawed at me. I replayed Jason's words over and over. An old Navy guy out of his prime selling lattes. The more I heard it in my head, the less it sounded like a joke and more like a decree. He wanted me small, forgotten, irrelevant. At a family brunch a week later, Jason joked again, this time about how maybe I could serve coffee at his office once he expanded to the big leagues. The table laughed politely. My daughter looked down at her plate. I forced a chuckle, but my hands clenched under the tablecloth, nails biting into skin. I realized then that it wasn't a one-time slip at the steakhouse. It was a pattern, a stage, and I was the punchline. That night, I stood in front of the mirror and saw a man I barely recognized. Wrinkles deeper, eyes dulled. But beneath the exhaustion was something else, something steady, something unbroken. I whispered to my reflection. A vow no one else would hear. They think I'm finished. Let them. I won't be their joke forever. Sleep didn't come easily after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jason's grin, heard the echo of laughter bouncing off steakhouse walls, felt the weight of my daughter's silence. I began to drift through my days in a haze, doing chores on autopilot, greeting neighbors with a smile that never reached my eyes. But in the stillness of night, I replayed every sacrifice I had made for that family, and how easily they had erased it all. I remembered the day I sold my stamp collection, a treasure I had built since childhood. Rare pieces, carefully kept through deployments, storms, and moves. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a piece of my life. Jason needed funds to cover a shortfall in his business, and I convinced myself that stamps could be replaced, but family could not. I handed him the check, and he didn't even ask what it had cost me. I remembered the pension cuts, the long hours I had spent at the Navy, thinking retirement would mean security, only to watch myself trim it away so Jason could make payroll. I told myself it was temporary, that he'd pay me back. He never did. I remembered signing those bank papers, my name tied to his mortgage. He had hugged me that day, strong and tight, saying I was the father he never had. The warmth of that moment had been real, or maybe it had only been real for me. But now, all of that was dust. None of it had bought me respect. None of it had protected me from the humiliation of becoming a punchline at my own birthday dinner. As I sat on the porch one evening, the sun bleeding into the horizon, I finally admitted what I had been avoiding. Jason didn't see me as family. He saw me as a resource, a wallet, a guarantor, a man to lean on until he no longer had use for me. My loyalty had been blind, and he had taken every ounce of it. That realization hurt worse than his laughter. Because betrayal doesn't come from enemies, it comes from those you trusted most. I clenched my jaw and whispered into the warm night air, a vow sharper than any blade. You've taken enough, Jason. One day, I'll take back everything you thought was yours. Sacrifice has a way of etching itself into your bones. I thought back to the day I parted with my stamp collection, the one thing that had traveled with me through deployments, storms at sea, and lonely barracks nights. Each stamp carried a memory, a fragment of history I had touched with my own hands. Some men invest in stocks, some in land. Me? I invested in paper squares, rare and delicate, worth more than gold to collectors. They were supposed to be my legacy, something to pass down when I was gone. But Jason called me one night, his voice trembling, telling me his business was on the edge. Dad, if I don't cover this, I'll lose everything. The bank's breathing down my neck. Please help me this once. My heart clenched. I didn't hesitate. The very next morning, I walked into the appraisal office with a box I had guarded for decades. I watched as the man flipped through my treasures with gloved hands, speaking in numbers instead of stories. When he slid the check across the counter, I felt hollow. Something irreplaceable had been reduced to currency. I handed Jason the money without ceremony. His relief was instant, his gratitude loud. You saved me, Dad. I swear I'll make this right. He hugged me tight, like a son. For a moment, I believed it was worth the loss. For a moment, I thought loyalty still meant something. Weeks turned into months, and Jason never mentioned repayment. The promise dissolved into thin air. I tried not to think about it, tried to convince myself that seeing my daughter secure and their family safe was enough. But every time I passed the empty spot in my cabinet where those stamps once sat, I felt the sting. Looking back, that was the first time I gave up a part of myself to keep Jason afloat, and it would not be the last. Sacrifice became my language, my offering, my quiet burden. I thought it was love. But to Jason, it was just business, and I was the investor he never planned to repay. Jason's business did take off for a while. With the money I gave him, he leased a sleek office downtown, bought shiny furniture, and filled the place with eager young employees. He strutted around like a king, talking about expansion, about owning the market. And every time he held a glass of champagne, I could hear my stamp collection clinking inside it. At first, I was proud. I wanted to believe I had helped build something worthwhile. When Jason called me in for a tour, I walked those polished floors with genuine admiration. He introduced me to his staff as the man who believed in me, and I felt a swell in my chest. For a brief moment, I thought the respect was still there. But admiration is a fragile thing. It didn't take long for the story to change. Soon I became my wife's dad, who gave me a little boost, as if my sacrifice had been pocket change. When investors came by, Jason painted himself as self-made. My name disappeared from the narrative. I wasn't the believer anymore. I was the forgotten stepping stone. His arrogance grew with each deal closed. He bought a new car, bragged about vacations, and treated success like it had been inevitable. At family gatherings, he shifted the spotlight onto himself. If I spoke up offering a lesson from years of leadership, he'd wave me off. It's different now, Dad. Business isn't about discipline and order. It's about risk and boldness. My daughter laughed, leaning into his shoulder. My words hung in the air like smoke, quickly brushed away. One evening, after dinner, I mentioned the possibility of opening my own small coffee shop. Just a passing thought, really. Jason chuckled, sipping his wine. That's cute, he said. But cafes aren't businesses, they're hobbies, something retirees do when they're bored. The table chuckled with him. My daughter smiled weakly, but no one defended me. That was the night I realized success had not humbled him, it had corrupted him. My sacrifice hadn't bought me a place of honor, it had bought me a seat at his comedy show, where my dreams were the punchline. When my daughter's wedding came around, I knew Jason didn't have the funds to cover the celebration he wanted. He dreamed big, lavish halls, live music, an open bar, the works. I should have insisted on something simpler, something within their reach. But I looked at my daughter's eyes, shining with expectation, and I couldn't bear to dim that light, so I picked up the slack. I worked odd jobs after retirement security shifts, handyman repairs, even a stint driving deliveries. My back ached, my knees burned, but every dollar I scraped together went toward that wedding. I told myself it was worth it, that a father's job didn't end with retirement. When the big day came, everything was perfect. Jason strutted around in a tailored suit, shaking hands, thanking people for coming. He looked every bit the successful man he wanted the world to see, but not once did he acknowledge the man who made it possible. During his toast, Jason raised his glass and spoke about ambition, about building a future with courage. He praised my daughter, called her the best partner a man could ask for. He thanked his parents for raising him, thanked his friends for standing by him. My name never left his lips. I clinked my glass anyway, smiling through the sting. My daughter looked radiant, and I convinced myself that was enough. But later that night, I overheard him boasting to his friends. "I pulled this whole thing off without a dime of debt," he bragged. They clapped him on the back, admiring his so-called independence. I stood in the shadows, jaw tight, saying nothing. Let him have his moment, I thought. Maybe he would grow. Maybe he would remember. He never did. In his story, I was invisible. All the hours I spent working, all the sacrifices I made, they didn't exist. He had rewritten the narrative, casting himself as the hero. And me? I was just a ghost in the wings, clapping for a show I had paid to stage. That was when I began to understand Jason didn't just forget sacrifices. He erased them. The house they live in today, its white columns, the manicured lawn, the grand porch where Jason likes to pose for photos that house wouldn't exist without me. Jason couldn't secure the mortgage alone. The bank laughed him out of the office the first time. But with my name on the dotted line, doors opened. I had earned trust through decades of steady service and spotless credit. I staked my own future on their dream. I remember the day we signed the papers. Jason beamed like he had just conquered the world. My daughter hugged me tightly, whispering, "We couldn't have done this without you, Dad." For a fleeting moment, I felt useful again, like I was still a protector, still a provider. I told myself it was worth the risk, that I had given them a foundation to build their lives on. But as months passed, the gratitude faded into entitlement. Jason paraded the house as his own achievement, bragging about how his hard work had landed him such a prize. He filled it with expensive furniture, gadgets, and parties that stretched late into the night. Neighbors admired his success, never knowing the man across town was quietly shouldering the burden if things went wrong. When bills piled up and deadlines loomed, Jason turned to me again. "Dad, just until the next deal closes," he'd say, his voice dripping with urgency. And again, I covered the shortfall, trimming from my pension, holding back on repairs my own house needed. My roof leaked, my pipes groaned, but I told myself it didn't matter. Family came first. The irony never left me. While Jason stood tall on that grand porch, playing the role of self-made man, I was patching holes in my own roof with tarps. He lived like a king, while I lived like a ghost, watching from the shadows as my sacrifices were rewritten into his triumphs. And each time he called me reliable or steady, I realized those words were not compliments. They were shackles. To Jason, I wasn't a man. I was insurance. Family gatherings began to feel like hostile territory. Where once I had been the head of the table, telling stories of Navy days and offering guidance, now I was an afterthought, an old relic tucked into the corner. Jason dominated every conversation, painting vivid pictures of his deals and ventures, talking over me with the ease of a man who believed he owned the room. I tried to join in, sharing lessons I had learned at sea about leadership, about reading men, about knowing when to advance and when to retreat. Jason smirked, swirling his drink. "That's all well and good, Dad, but this isn't war. It's business. Times have changed." The words stung more than I let on. My daughter laughed nervously, siding with him in silence. The grandchildren picked up on the cues. Once, they had hung on my every word, begging for stories about storms and survival. Now, they looked to Jason for entertainment. He told them about fast cars and flashy trips, promising them rides when they were older. Grandpa's stories are from the past, he said casually. The future is more exciting. Their young eyes lit up, and my heart sank. Even small traditions slipped away. I used to carve the turkey on Thanksgiving. One year Jason took the knife from my hand, joking, "Let the professional do it." Everyone laughed as he posed dramatically, carving with exaggerated flair. I sat back, my hands trembling under the tablecloth. They didn't see the humiliation in my eyes. Or maybe they did, and simply didn't care. Every gathering became another reminder that my place was shrinking. My voice carried less weight, my presence less meaning. I had built the foundation of their lives with my sacrifices, yet I was treated like background noise. A dependable chair filler, a relic of discipline in a world that worshipped arrogance. It was then I began to see the truth clearly. Jason wasn't just eroding my respect. He was erasing me from my own family's story. Jason's contempt bled into every part of my life. He never raised his voice, never outright cursed me, but his words carried the same weight as a slap. Whenever I offered advice on finances, on parenting, even on fixing a leaky faucet, he dismissed me with a smirk. "Dad, you're out of touch. Things don't work that way anymore." He said it in front of my daughter, in front of the children, in front of guests. Each time, my authority shrank another inch. I had spent decades in the Navy, commanding men in storms, making decisions when lives were at stake. Yet in my own family, my voice was drowned out by a man who thought leadership meant arrogance and a quick tongue. I tried to remind myself that patience was strength, that silence could hold dignity, but the silence felt less like strength and more like erasure. The most painful moments came when he undermined me with the grandchildren. I would share stories meant to teach resilience, stories of facing fear in the open sea. Jason would chuckle and say, "Grandpa's tales are bedtime stories, not lessons. Don't take them too seriously." The children laughed along, their faith shifting toward him. My words, once treasures to them, became punchlines. At holidays, when gifts were exchanged, Jason made a show of his extravagance flashy toys. The newest gadgets, my modest presents, chosen with care, were forgotten within minutes. He patted my back and said, "You mean well, Dad, but kids these days need more excitement." As though thoughtfulness was outdated, I began to feel invisible in my own bloodline. The respect I once carried was stripped away piece by piece, each slight cutting deeper than the last. But I stayed quiet, clinging to the belief that family bonds were stronger than pride. I told myself tolerance was noble. Yet deep down, I knew the truth. Jason wasn't just dismissing me, he was training everyone else to do the same. And each time I stayed silent, I handed him the hammer to break what little respect remained. The older I grew, the more I saw my sacrifices piling up like stones on my back, each one placed there by Jason's hand, each one heavier than the last. I had given him money, time, trust, even my dignity, and in return he gave me scorn. What cut deepest was not his arrogance, but the quiet acceptance of those around us. My daughter's silence, my grandchildren's laughter, the family's complicity. They all let him chip away at me until there was almost nothing left. I remembered the early years, when I thought of Jason as the son I never had. I had told friends I was lucky, a real go-getter, sharp and ambitious. I wore pride like armor, blind to the cracks. But now I understood. Ambition without gratitude is poison, and I had been feeding it with my own hands. Nights became long vigils of reflection. I'd sit on the porch, staring into the dark, replaying every humiliation, like a film stuck on loop. The steakhouse dinner was the climax, but the truth was, it had been building for years. I was no longer a man in Jason's eyes. I was a prop, a wallet, a placeholder in the family he wanted to rewrite in his image. That knowledge hurt more than anything I faced in the Navy. Out at sea, you knew your enemies. You faced storms head-on. But betrayal at home is a quieter kind of storm. It seeps into the walls, into the laughter, until it feels normal, until you forget who you used to be. But I hadn't forgotten, not entirely. Somewhere inside me, the old discipline still lived. The part of me that knew patience wasn't just about endurance, it was about timing. I realized I didn't need Jason's approval, didn't need his permission to dream. What I needed was resolve, and resolve was something I had in spades. So I stayed silent, biding my time. I let him believe I was broken, that I was finished. I let him laugh, let him sneer, let him stack the stones higher, because I knew one day I'd shift the weight, and when I did, it wouldn't just come crashing down on me, it would bury him too. After the steakhouse humiliation, I found myself walking past coffee shops more often, lingering at their windows, studying the rhythm of people coming and going, the hiss of espresso machines, the low hum of conversation, the smell of roasted beans. It stirred something in me. Maybe Jason thought it was a joke, but to me, the idea of a coffee shop was more than a hobby. It was a purpose, a place where stories could be shared, where people could feel seen, something I no longer felt at home. I began keeping a small notebook in my jacket pocket. At first, it was just observations: what kind of pastries sold out quickest, which shops stayed busiest at different times of day, how baristas greeted customers. But slowly, those notes turned into plans: floor layouts, equipment lists, even names for the shop. Each page gave me back a piece of the self Jason had tried to strip away. I spent afternoons at the library, poring over books on small business management and hospitality. I watched tutorials online, learning the science behind brewing. My Navy training had taught me to respect precision, and coffee demanded at water temperature, grind size, extraction time. It was a craft, one I could master. I found comfort in that discipline. The more I learned, the clearer my vision became. I wanted a shop that wasn't just about caffeine, but about community. A place with walls lined in photographs of sailors, veterans, and ordinary folks who had weathered storms of their own. A space where discipline met warmth, where no one was mocked for their dreams. At night, while Jason drank and bragged in his grand house, I sat at my kitchen table, sketching layouts under the glow of a single lamp. The same man he called washed up was quietly charting a new course. And for the first time in years, I felt that old spark of command, the knowledge that I could still build, still lead, still fight. Jason thought he had ended me at that dinner table. What he didn't know was that he had just lit the fuse. As my vision for the coffee shop grew sharper, Jason's empire began to wobble. I caught glimpses of it in the news, whispers in conversations, subtle signs that others overlooked. His business wasn't as solid as he pretended. Clients pulled out of contracts, suppliers complained about late payments, and one of his investors quietly sued him for breach of agreement. The shine on his kingdom was cracking. I started digging, not out of malice, but out of habit. The Navy had taught me to study the field before moving. I pulled records, scoured public filings, spoke with contacts I still had downtown. The picture that formed was clear. Jason was drowning in debt. His flashy cars were leased, his parties bought on credit, his self-made success nothing more than smoke and mirrors. Part of me wanted to confront him, to throw the truth in his face. But I bit my tongue. Timing was everything. Better to let him believe his illusion while I built something real. Let him laugh at my hobby while his foundation rotted beneath him. One night, while scrolling through court documents, I found proof of just how fragile his world was. Lawsuits piling up, eviction threats from his office landlord, payroll delays. And yet, he strutted at family dinners as though he were untouchable. My daughter clung to the illusion, either blind to the truth or unwilling to face it. My grandchildren still cheered his every word, dazzled by toys and stories he could no longer afford. I kept my discoveries to myself. It wasn't time yet. But inside, a quiet satisfaction grew. Jason had mocked me for dreaming small, but dreams built on sacrifice and discipline last. His world, built on arrogance and credit, was already collapsing. I didn't need to push him over the edge. Gravity was doing that for me. All I had to do was stand ready when the fall came and make sure he never landed on me again. I knew I couldn't walk this path alone. The dream of a coffee shop was bigger than me, and if I was going to do it right, I needed guidance, not from Jason or anyone in my family, but from someone who understood discipline, contracts, and the value of loyalty. That's when I reached out to an old Navy friend, Mark Daniels. We had served together during some of the roughest seas, a man I trusted with my life. He had since traded his uniform for a suit, building a reputation as a sharp lawyer downtown. When I called him, his voice lit up with surprise. "Rodrigo Collins," he said, "I thought you'd disappeared into retirement." "Not disappeared," I replied, "just waiting for the right mission." We met at a small diner, nothing fancy, just hot coffee and quiet booths. I laid everything out: Jason's humiliations, the sacrifices I'd made, the dream I had left. Mark listened without interruption, his eyes steady, his expression calm. When I finished, he leaned forward and spoke words that anchored me. "Then we do this by the book. Paper trails, airtight contracts, no shortcuts. If Jason tries to touch what's yours, he won't have a leg to stand on." Together, we began drafting a plan. He introduced me to real estate contacts who owed him favors, accountants who could structure the finances cleanly, and architects who could turn my sketches into blueprints. Every detail was examined, every risk measured. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting to Jason's chaos, I was building something of my own. Mark reminded me of the man I used to be, focused, precise, patient. Each step forward with him felt like reclaiming ground I had lost. The Navy had taught us both that revenge wasn't about rage, it was about strategy. And this was the most important operation of my life. Jason thought I was finished, but now I had a lawyer, a plan, and a mission. He wouldn't see me coming until it was too late. The first real step came with the purchase of property. Mark helped me navigate the maze of contracts and negotiations, ensuring every paper was watertight. We found a row of shops in the heart of downtown, a stretch that had seen better days but was ripe for renewal. Where others saw decay, I saw potential. Navy men are trained to see not just the storm, but the calm that comes after. I walked those cracked sidewalks at dawn, the city still half asleep, and imagined what could rise there. A coffee house with tall windows, warm lights spilling onto the street, laughter and voices filling the air. A place that would outlast Jason's shallow empire. The thought steadied me. Signing the deed was unlike anything I'd done before. No cheering crowds, no applause, no Jason mocking from the sidelines. Just me, Mark, and the steady scratch of a pen across paper. Ownership. Mine. I left the office that day with the keys heavy in my pocket and a fire steady in my chest. I didn't tell my daughter. I didn't tell Jason. This wasn't their story to share. This was mine. And secrecy was power. Let them believe I was sulking in silence while I was, in truth, laying the foundation of something that would outlast them all. With the deed secure, I began shaping the vision more clearly. Contractors walked the site. Architects unfolded blueprints across dusty counters. They spoke in terms of cost and timelines. But I heard opportunity. Each nail, each brick, would be a quiet strike back at Jason's laughter. The same man who mocked me for dreaming small had no idea I was now the owner of a stretch of downtown he couldn't afford to touch. It felt like reclaiming territory after a long siege. And as I stood in the middle of those empty storefronts, dust swirling around me, I thought of Jason's smug face at the steakhouse. He had no idea that the man he mocked had just claimed ground beneath his feet. The vision took shape piece by piece. I wanted more than a coffee shop. I wanted a sanctuary, a place where people felt valued, not dismissed. I worked with designers who understood clean lines and warm tones, a balance of Navy discipline and civilian comfort. Every choice carried meaning. Wooden tables sturdy enough to last decades, walls lined with photographs of sailors, workers, and families who had endured storms of their own. A counter built wide and strong, like the deck of a ship. I thought often about the people Jason had left behind, employees he fired when times got tough, vendors he refused to pay, assistants he belittled until they quit. They were casualties of his arrogance, forgotten the moment they no longer served his pride. I reached out to some of them quietly, not as a savior, not as a handout, but as an invitation. I'm opening something new, I told them. I want people who know what it feels like to be overlooked. The response surprised me. They were eager, not just for work, but for redemption. Many of them had stories like mine, sacrifices dismissed, loyalty repaid with cruelty. One young man said, I'd scrub floors if it meant proving him wrong. That fire mirrored my own. Together, we weren't just building a business, we were building proof. Each day at the construction site, I felt stronger. Dust clung to my boots, sweat rolled down my back, but it was the kind of labor that restored rather than drained. I wasn't patching holes in Jason's sinking ship anymore. I was building my own vessel, plank by plank, nail by nail. Jason had mocked my dream as a hobby, but standing there, watching walls rise and light fixtures glow for the first time, I knew the truth. This wasn't a pastime. It was a fortress, a place built from sacrifice, discipline, and resolve. And soon, it would open its doors to the very people Jason had cast aside. Word spread faster than I expected. At first, it was just whispers, neighbors curious about the renovation downtown, old Navy buddies asking what I was up to, vendors noticing I was hiring people Jason had discarded. But then the local press caught wind of it, a retired Navy veteran opening a coffee house with a mission to serve community. Reporters called it a comeback story. I didn't correct them, let them write it that way. The first article ran in the city paper, From Sea to Steam. Veteran launches coffeehouse revival. A photo of me standing in the unfinished space, dust on my boots, plans rolled under my arm, spread across the page. The response was immediate. Strangers shook my hand on the street. Veterans offered to donate memorabilia. Small business owners welcomed me into their circle. My phone rang with people offering support, ideas, even free publicity. Jason didn't know yet, at least not directly. But I heard the murmurs at family dinners. "Did you hear about the cafe downtown?" Someone would mention casually. Jason brushed it off with a laugh, claiming he had bigger projects to worry about. But I noticed the twitch in his jaw, the way his eyes flickered with unease. He knew the tide was shifting, even if he wouldn't admit it. Every article, every handshake, every supportive nod reminded me that I wasn't invisible. I wasn't some relic gathering dust. I had a story worth telling, and people wanted to hear it. The very dream Jason had ridiculed was becoming a beacon, not just for me, but for others who believed they had been underestimated. When the local news station asked for an interview, I stood in front of the cameras with calm confidence. "This isn't about proving anyone wrong," I said carefully. "It's about proving that it's never too late to start again." But deep down, I knew the truth. Every brick laid, every headline printed, was another nail in Jason's coffin. He had mocked me for daring to dream. Now, the whole city was watching that dream come alive. By the time the walls were painted and the machines installed, I had learned the art of patience all over again. Jason's downfall wasn't something I had to rush. It was unfolding on its own. Investors pulled back, lawsuits multiplied, and whispers of bankruptcy swirled around his name like vultures circling a dying animal. Still, he strutted at family gatherings, holding court with stories of big projects in the pipeline. I said nothing. Silence became my weapon. Each night, after locking up the shop in progress, I sat by the front window, staring at the reflection of the streetlights on the glass. The place smelled of fresh paint and sawdust, but to me, it already smelled of roasted beans and new beginnings. I pictured Jason walking past one day, seeing my name above the door. I imagined the flicker in his eyes when he realized the man he had mocked had built something permanent while his own empire crumbled. I kept my progress quiet, even from my daughter. She asked now and then what I had been doing with my time, and I smiled, told her I was keeping busy. She didn't press. Perhaps she didn't want to know. Perhaps she was too entangled in Jason's illusions to face the truth. Either way, I kept my mission sealed. The Navy taught me that revenge wasn't about shouting the loudest. It was about waiting for the perfect moment to strike when the enemy was most exposed. Jason was unraveling, and he didn't even see it. And me? I was stronger than I had been in years, focused, clear, ready. So I let him laugh. I let him carry on, mocking me at dinners, bragging to his friends, clinging to an image already turning to dust. Because I knew soon enough the spotlight would shift, soon enough his stage would crumble, and when the curtain finally fell, I would be standing in the light, calm and steady, with no need to raise my voice. Jason thought he was the storyteller, but he had no idea I was the one writing the ending. The first cracks in Jason's empire became headlines. Investors pulled out publicly, suppliers sued for unpaid invoices, and one morning, the business section of the newspaper splashed his name under the title, "Local Entrepreneur Faces Financial Collapse." I clipped the article and tucked it into a folder. Proof, not just of his downfall, but of how fragile his so-called empire had always been. Mark and I moved quietly. Together we gathered every document, court filings, unpaid debt notices, eviction threats from his office landlord. Each paper was another brick in the wall closing in on Jason. We didn't forge anything, didn't twist the truth. We simply put light on the facts he had worked so hard to bury. Then came the timing. With Mark's guidance, I leaked the documents to the right people, business journals, community boards, even a few former partners who had been waiting for their chance at vindication. I didn't sign my name, didn't need credit. The truth spoke loudly enough on its own. The effect was immediate. Calls stopped coming for Jason. Allies vanished. Deals evaporated overnight. The same men who once clapped his back at family dinners now whispered about betrayal and dishonesty. His kingdom wasn't just crumbling, it was collapsing in full view of the city. I sat in my nearly finished coffee shop, watching contractors install the last light fixtures, and read every article with quiet satisfaction. This wasn't revenge through rage. This was justice, cold and deliberate, carved into public record. Jason's laughter at the steakhouse had once filled a room with shame. Now the sound of silence filled his world, no calls, no contracts, no applause. The man who mocked me for dreaming small had been reduced to a cautionary tale, his name dragged through the mud not by me, but by his own arrogance. For the first time in years, I breathed deeply, freely. The balance had shifted, and it was only the beginning. The fallout came fast and merciless. Jason had built his reputation on borrowed money and louder-than-life promises. When the truth surfaced, his so-called allies vanished. Investors who once bragged about being in his circle now pretended they had barely known him. Former employees spoke up, sharing stories of late paychecks and broken contracts. Even the local news, once charmed by his slick interviews, began to tear apart his legacy. I watched quietly from my corner of the world, never stepping into the light, never claiming credit. I didn't need to. The city did the work for me. Each headline was another nail sealing his fate. Miller Enterprises under investigation. Clients sue over fraudulent deals. Community turns back on local entrepreneur. At family gatherings, I saw the shift. Jason's voice, once booming with confidence, grew quieter. He still tried to dominate the room, but fewer people laughed at his jokes. The sparkle in my daughter's eyes dimmed. Neighbors who used to crowd around him at barbecues now avoided eye contact. He was becoming a ghost of his own making. Meanwhile, my coffee house neared completion. The irony wasn't lost on me. While his empire crumbled, mine was rising brick by brick, beam by beam. And unlike his, mine was built on truth, sacrifice, and a foundation he could never touch. I remember sitting in the shop one night, the lights finally working, the machines humming for the first time. The air smelled of fresh paint and roasted beans, a promise of what was to come. Outside, the street buzzed with talk not of Jason but of the new place opening soon. My place. Jason had once sneered that I was out of my prime, but now he was the one out of moves, out of allies, out of time. The community that had once applauded him now applauded his downfall. And I didn't lift a finger in anger. I simply let the truth shine, and watched as Jason's shadow shrank into nothing. Jason's collapse became a spectacle, and I made sure to aim the spotlight where it hurt the most. With Mark's guidance, I shared carefully chosen documents with people Jason had wronged, former partners, employees, and even suppliers who had written him off as untouchable. Each one seized the opportunity to come forward. One by one, his so-called allies turned into accusers. The circle that once cheered his arrogance now closed in with demands, lawsuits, and public statements. At community events, I noticed the shift. Where Jason had once been the man everyone wanted to shake hands with, now people avoided him, whispering as he passed. His name became a warning. Don't trust too easily. Don't invest too recklessly. Parents who once praised him as a role model now used his story as a lesson in pride and dishonesty. The humiliation he had poured onto me at the steakhouse returned to him tenfold, only his stage was much larger. News anchors discussed his failures on evening broadcasts. Business journals published op-eds about arrogance in leadership, citing Jason Miller by name. And all the while, I stayed silent, sipping coffee in my nearly completed shop, letting the world do what it does best, tear down false idols. The irony was sharp. Jason had thrived on attention, and now attention was his executioner. Every headline dug his grave deeper. Every former ally who abandoned him stripped another layer from the empire he thought indestructible. Meanwhile, word of my coffee house spread with excitement. People spoke not of Jason's downfall, but of my rise. A Navy veteran opening a new spot downtown, about time we had something real. I overheard at the grocery store. Their words filled me with a quiet pride Jason could never understand. He once called me irrelevant. Now, he was the one erased. His name carried weight no longer, only shame. And mine? Mine was being whispered with respect again, the way it always should have been. The day of the grand opening arrived like a sunrise after a long storm. The coffee house stood tall on the corner of Main Street, its windows gleaming, the smell of fresh beans drifting out into the morning air. A line had already formed before the doors opened. Neighbors, veterans, curious locals, even reporters with cameras slung around their shoulders. The sign above the door read, Collins Coffee House. My name, not Jason's, mine. I wore a crisp shirt, my navy pin fastened to the collar. As I stood at the entrance, greeting each person who walked through the doors, I felt something I hadn't in years, pride untainted by sacrifice. People weren't laughing. They weren't mocking. They were celebrating. Inside, the walls told stories. Photographs of sailors, workers, families' faces of resilience hung where Jason's flashy decor would never have fit. The employees, many of them once discarded by Jason, now bustled with energy and purpose. Customers noticed. "You can feel it here," one woman said, sipping her latte. "It's not just coffee, it's respect." Reporters gathered around, microphones in hand. I spoke simply, calmly. "This shop is about community, about second chances. It's proof that it's never too late to build something real." Applause filled the room, and for a moment I let myself soak it in. Then, as if fate had scripted it, Jason appeared outside. He lingered at the edge of the crowd, his suit rumpled, his face pale under the sunlight. Gone was the swagger, gone was the booming laughter. He looked like a man who had lost not just his wealth, but his story. I watched him through the glass as cameras flashed, but I didn't wave him in. This was no longer his stage. The tables had turned, and the spotlight was mine. The same community that once clapped for his arrogance now stood in line for my coffee. Jason had tried to humiliate me in public. Now, without a single word from my lips, the public delivered him the humiliation back. And the doors to Colin's coffee house kept swinging open. It didn't take long before Jason finally crossed the threshold. He waited until most of the reporters had gone, until the crowd had thinned. He walked in wearing a wrinkled shirt, no tie, the smell of stale cologne clinging to him like a desperate mask. His eyes darted around the coffee house, scanning the busy tables, the smiling staff, the buzz of customers. He looked like a man entering enemy territory. He found me behind the counter, helping an employee adjust the espresso machine. For a moment, he hesitated, as if unsure how to approach me. Then he cleared his throat and forced a smile. "Dad," he said, his voice low but trembling. "This place, it's impressive." I nodded but didn't offer words. Silence was heavier than any reply. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the floor. "I was wondering if maybe you had room for one more. I could help out. Serve tables. Maybe manage shifts. Whatever you need." "At is no to, but note is the new." There it was, the same man who had once mocked me in front of an entire steakhouse, now standing in my shop, asking for work. The weight of that irony nearly buckled me, but I held steady, watching him squirm. "I know I said things," he continued quickly, "stupid things. But times are hard. I could really use the chance." His hands fidgeted, tugging at the cuffs of his shirt. His voice carried none of the swagger it once had. He sounded small. Customers nearby had begun to notice. A hush spread across the room as eyes turned toward us. Jason's humiliation was no longer private, it was unfolding in the very space he had once called a joke. I took a slow breath, letting the moment hang in the air. The man who had erased my sacrifices, who had sneered at my dreams, was now begging to be a part of them. For years I had been invisible in his story. Now he was invisible in mine. I met his eyes, calm and unshaken, and prepared my answer. The entire shop seemed to hold its breath as Jason stood there, waiting for me to respond. His shoulders sagged under the weight of silence. I remembered every slight, every smirk, every time he had dismissed me as old-fashioned. I remembered the steakhouse, the laughter, the sting of being mocked in front of my own family. And now here he was, stripped of pride, asking for crumbs from my table. I set down the portafilter I'd been holding, wiped my hands on a towel, and looked him square in the eye. My voice was steady, quiet, but every word carried the weight of years. "This isn't just coffee, Jason. This is proof that I never needed your approval." His face fell, the last of his forced smile collapsing into something raw, something almost childlike. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. Around us, customers shifted, some whispering, some simply watching. A few of my employees, those he had once fired, stood straighter, pride gleaming in their eyes. Jason swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "So, that's it?" he asked, voice breaking. I nodded once. "That's it." He lingered for a moment longer, as though hoping I would change my mind, that I would take pity and extend the same hand I had extended too many times before. But I didn't. I had carried him for years, sacrificed pieces of myself to keep him afloat. That debt was closed, not with forgiveness, but with finality. Jason turned and walked out, the bell above the door chiming softly as it closed behind him. The room exhaled. Conversations picked up again, customers returning to their drinks and laughter. The world moved forward, with or without him. I picked up the portafilter, locked it into place, and pulled another shot of espresso. My hands were steady, my heart calm. For the first time in decades, I felt no weight on my shoulders. The war was over, and I had won. Jason's departure didn't go unnoticed. Word spread quickly. People talked about how the once proud entrepreneur had walked into Colin's coffee house begging for work and left with nothing. No one said it outright to me, but I heard the whispers in the community, the quiet retellings that carried the story further than I ever could. The humiliation he once orchestrated at the steakhouse had returned to him, magnified, replayed in living rooms and corner shops across town. The cameras caught it too. A freelance photographer had snapped shots of him walking out, head bowed, shoulders hunched, the sign of my coffee house glowing behind him. The image made its way online, shared with captions like "Tables Turned" and "The Fall of Jason Miller." The man who had thrived on attention now found himself destroyed by it. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The silence I had held for years had blossomed into the loudest answer possible. Jason's downfall became its own lesson, one I didn't have to teach. The same community that once clapped for his arrogance now pitied him, or worse, ignored him altogether. At home, I clipped the photo from the paper and slid it into the same folder where I had kept articles of his collapse. Not out of spite, but as a record. A reminder of how far things had turned, how patience and resolve had carried me through. When I walked through the shop the next morning, employees greeted me with smiles that weren't forced, weren't shallow. Customers chatted warmly, some nodding to me with quiet respect. The place thrummed with life, not performance, real life. And Jason? He had no stage left. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood at the front window, looking out at the street where Jason once strutted so proudly. The world had moved on without him. His shadow no longer loomed over me. The laughter that had once haunted me was gone, replaced by something steadier, something I had built with my own hands. The power was no longer his, it was mine, and I carried it in silence. The weeks after Jason's humiliation felt like a shift in seasons. My shop grew busier each day, the line stretching down the block on Saturday mornings. Locals called it a new landmark, a place that belonged to the city. Veterans gathered at the long table in the back, sharing stories over steaming mugs. College students filled notebooks in the corner, and parents brought their children to enjoy pastries baked fresh each dawn. The air was alive with laughter, the kind that healed rather than wounded. Jason, meanwhile, seemed to vanish. No more articles about him, no more parties or flashy cars. His empire had dissolved into debt and silence. A neighbor mentioned seeing him once, sitting alone outside a convenience store, his phone pressed to his ear as he argued with someone about money. But even those sightings grew rare. He had gone from the center of attention to a man people passed without noticing. One afternoon, a regular customer pointed at the wall of photographs in the shop and asked why I chose to decorate it with faces of ordinary people instead of celebrities. I smiled and said, "Because respect doesn't come from fame, it comes from endurance." That answer spread, quoted in a local magazine, and the shop became known as more than a cafe. It was a place of values. I didn't chase fame, but it found me anyway. Invitations came from community groups, veteran organizations, even schools wanting me to speak. Each time I thought of Jason at the steakhouse, laughing as the room joined in. And each time I realized that his laughter had only been fuel, pushing me here. On the anniversary of that humiliating dinner, I sat at the counter of my thriving shop, sipping coffee while the crowd buzzed around me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. Jason had taken enough from me already. What remained was strength, quiet and steady, built from every sacrifice I had once thought wasted. Jason had written me off as finished. But here I was, alive in every way that mattered. And him? He was nothing but a shadow that no longer reached my door. Freedom didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly, like the steady drip of rain washing away years of grime. For the first time in decades, I woke each morning without a knot in my chest. No phone calls demanding money, no humiliations to swallow, no family dinners where my voice was drowned out. Just the hum of my coffee machines warming up, the chatter of customers filtering in, and the knowledge that I had built something no one could take from me. I walked the floor of Colin's coffee house with calm steps, shaking hands, listening to stories, watching faces soften as they felt at home. Respect didn't have to be demanded here. It flowed naturally, earned in the way we treated each other. Every smile from a customer, every thank you from an employee, was a reminder that I was no longer invisible. Jason's name rarely came up anymore. When it did, it was spoken with pity or as a cautionary tale. "He flew too close to the sun," someone muttered once while waiting for their latte. Another customer shook her head and said, "He had everything handed to him and still ruined it." I didn't correct them. Their version of the story was enough. My daughter visited occasionally, though the visits were quiet. She avoided talking about Jason, and I didn't bring him up. She looked around the shop with a mix of awe and guilt, perhaps realizing all the years I had been right there, supporting, sacrificing, waiting. I didn't press her. She had her own lessons to carry. At night, when the lights dimmed and the shop emptied, I sat alone with a cup of coffee and thought of all that had been taken from me, my savings, my treasures, my dignity. For years, I believed those sacrifices had been wasted, but now I saw them differently. They were not lost. They had been transformed. They had built this place, this peace, this freedom. I didn't need an apology from Jason. I didn't need forgiveness from my family. I had something far greater, a life rebuilt on my own terms. Peace revealed itself in small, steady rituals. I found joy in opening the shop at dawn, the smell of beans filling the air as the first light crept over Main Street. I took pride in wiping down the counters, in hearing the familiar hum of the espresso machine, in unlocking the doors to find customers already waiting. Every detail, every sound, was proof that I had built something lasting. The employees often joked that I worked harder than all of them. Maybe I did, but it wasn't work, it was living. Every cup I poured carried more than coffee. It carried dignity, discipline, and the knowledge that no one could take this away from me. Some mornings, veterans would stop in just to shake my hand, telling me they were proud to see one of their own building a legacy. Those words mattered more than Jason's approval ever could. Jason himself faded into the background of town life. Rumors placed him chasing odd jobs, trying to scrape together a living. Some said he was looking to move away, start over where no one knew his name. I didn't pay much attention. His choices were no longer my concern. I had wasted too many years carrying his burdens. Now, I carried only my own. One afternoon, as I was restocking pastries, a young woman approached me at the counter. She said, "My dad used to work for Jason. He told me to thank you. He said you gave him back his pride." Her words stopped me cold. For a moment, I saw my own reflection in her eyes, the man who had once felt invisible, mocked, dismissed, and now I was the one restoring others. The circle had closed. That night, I locked up the shop and lingered at the doorway, the street lamps glowing against the dark. I thought about the path I had walked, the sacrifices, the humiliation, the silence, and I realized something. Revenge wasn't about destroying Jason. It was about reclaiming myself, and I had done exactly that. As the months passed, the coffeehouse became more than a business. It became a refuge. People came not just for the drinks, but for the sense of belonging. I watched strangers strike up conversations at the long tables, students tutor each other in the corners, and veterans find a safe place to share stories they couldn't tell anywhere else. The walls absorbed laughter, grief, and hope. It was everything I had dreamed of, and more. Sometimes, when I saw fathers sitting with their children, showing them patience, I felt a sting of memory. I thought of Jason, of the nights he mocked me in front of my grandchildren, of the way he turned them against my stories. But then I looked at the kids in my shop, listening intently to their parents, and I realized those moments had not been erased. They had only been displaced. Respect had found its way back into my world, even if not through my own blood. My daughter visited less frequently. When she did, she seemed caught between pride and shame. She would compliment the decor, taste a pastry, and smile as though she wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. I didn't press her. I had stopped chasing recognition. She would face her own reckoning in silence, just as I had. One evening, a group of young entrepreneurs asked if I could share advice on starting a business. I told them the truth that discipline, patience, and integrity outlast shortcuts and arrogance. They nodded, taking notes, their eyes bright with ambition. For the first time in years, I felt like my words carried weight again. Jason had tried to erase me, but here I was, shaping futures. At closing time, I stood alone in the shop, staring at the wall of photographs. I added a new picture, a candid shot of the opening day, the crowd smiling, the sign above the door shining. It wasn't just decoration. It was proof that dignity, once taken, can be rebuilt. And with that photo, the story of my redemption was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone who had ever been underestimated. The seasons changed, and with them, So did I. Once, I had been defined by sacrifice, by what I gave up, by what others took from me. Now, I was defined by what I built. The shop flourished, steady as the tides I once sailed. I no longer lived in the shadow of Jason's mockery. Instead, I lived in the warmth of community, surrounded by people who valued honesty over arrogance. Jason's decline became a ghost story in town. People spoke of him the way sailors speak of storms long past dangerous in their time, but powerless now. Some said he left the city, chasing work elsewhere. Others claimed they saw him wandering near the old business district, thinner, older, unrecognizable from the man who once strutted through family dinners. Wherever he was, he no longer mattered to me. My story no longer needed him. My daughter visited one chilly afternoon, her hands wrapped around a cappuccino as she looked around the bustling shop. "You did this," she said softly, almost to herself. I nodded but didn't respond. Words weren't necessary. She saw what I had built. She knew. The grandchildren came too, now teenagers, eyes wide as they took in the space. They asked about the photos on the walls, about the stories behind the faces. For the first time in years, they listened, really listened, as I told them about men who had survived storms, about neighbors who had rebuilt after loss, about endurance as the truest form of strength. Their silence wasn't mocking this time, it was respect. As they left, my daughter lingered at the door, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Dad." She didn't say for what she didn't need to. I gave a small nod. Forgiveness wasn't necessary. Acknowledgement was enough. That night, I locked the doors and stood alone in the quiet shop. The machines were silent, the tables empty, but the air carried the echo of laughter and conversation. It was peace, pure and unshaken. I had finally stepped out of Jason's shadow, and I wasn't going back. Success has a way of drawing attention, but this time it was the right kind. Local magazines featured the coffee house as a symbol of resilience. Veteran groups held meetings in the back room, filling the space with camaraderie and respect. Even schools brought students on field trips, pointing to the shop as proof that integrity could build more than profit, it could build legacy. I found myself invited to speak at community events, something I never sought but accepted with quiet pride. Standing at podiums, I spoke not about Jason, not about betrayal, but about endurance. Discipline outlasts arrogance, I told them. Respect is not given, it's built, moment by moment. The applause wasn't thunderous like Jason once demanded, but it was steady, sincere. It reached deeper. One evening, after a long day, I stayed late cleaning tables. A man approached, hesitant. He had once worked for Jason, one of the many discarded when Jason cut corners. He looked me in the eye and said, "You gave us back something." He took dignity. "Thank you." Then he left, leaving me with words heavier than gold. Jason's shadow was nowhere near me anymore, but every so often I caught glimpses of his ghost. Rumors floated he was working odd shifts at a warehouse, living in a small, rented apartment. I didn't chase the details. His story no longer held power over mine. What mattered was the silence he left behind, a silence filled now with the voices of people who valued me. Late at night, I often sat in the darkened shop with a single light above the counter. I would sip my coffee and listen to the quiet. No laughter mocking me, no weight pressing down on my chest, just peace, pure, steady peace. And I realized then that revenge had never been about destroying Jason. It had been about building a life he could never touch. And I had done it. Winter came, and with it, a new clarity. Snow dusted the windows of the coffee house, but inside the air was warm with chatter and steam. Families gathered over cocoa, veterans swapped stories at the long table, and young people typed away on laptops. The shop had become more than a business. It was part of the town's heartbeat. One evening, as I shoveled snow from the entrance, an old neighbor stopped to talk. He lowered his voice, almost conspiratorial. "I saw Jason the other day. He didn't look well, thinner, worn down, nothing like he used to be." He shook his head and added, "Funny how life turns, huh?" I nodded but said nothing. There was no satisfaction in his ruin anymore, only distance. Later that night, as I locked the doors, I lingered by the window and watched the snowfall. I thought about the years I had lost savings, treasures, dignity, all the sacrifices I had poured into Jason's hollow empire. For so long, I believed they had been wasted. But now, looking at the shop glowing against the cold, I knew better. They hadn't been wasted. They had been transformed. My daughter visited that weekend with the grandchildren. They laughed, sipping hot chocolate and teasing me about my old Navy stories. This time, there was no mocking, no smirks. They listened. They respected. It wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about finally living the present with truth. As they left, my daughter hugged me longer than usual. She whispered, "You proved us all wrong, Dad." I didn't correct her. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving myself right. That night, I stood alone in the empty shop, the heater humming softly. Outside, the snow kept falling, silent and steady. I closed my eyes and breathed deep. No bitterness, no anger, just peace. Jason had once been the storm in my life. Now he was only weathered debris, carried away by time. And me, I was still standing stronger than ever. Spring arrived, and with it, the sense of finality I had been waiting for. The shop bloomed alongside the season flowers in the window boxes, fresh air drifting through the doors, new faces joining the regulars who already called the place home. Life felt full, not because I had erased Jason, but because I had rebuilt myself. One morning, as I brewed the first pot of coffee, I realized something profound. I no longer thought of him daily. The weight he once carried in my mind had dissolved. Jason was not forgiven, but he was finished. His name no longer haunted me. He was a chapter closed, a lesson etched, a storm survived. I focused on what I had, a thriving business, a respected place in the community, and a peace deeper than I thought possible. Veterans still came to swap stories. Children still pressed their noses to the pastry case, and young dreamers still asked me for advice. Each interaction reminded me that my life's value wasn't measured by Jason's approval or rejection. It was measured by what I chose to build. On the anniversary of the steakhouse humiliation, I poured myself a cup and sat by the front window. Outside, the city moved with its usual rhythm, buses hissing, cars honking, people rushing. Inside, the shop was calm, filled with the steady hum of voices and the hiss of steam. I raised the cup to my lips and spoke quietly, not to Jason, not to my daughter, but to myself. It's done. There was no anger left, no lingering bitterness, only freedom. Jason had mocked me for dreaming, tried to erase my sacrifices, and nearly convinced me I was invisible. But in the end, he was the one erased from the community, from respect, from relevance. And me? I stood taller than ever, not because I had beaten him, but because I had reclaimed myself. I didn't need applause, or vengeance, or even closure. I needed peace, and finally I had it.